What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise, or in this case, Tactical Tortoise TV. I actually picked up a bit of a cold over the weekend, so I apologize if my voice is a little rougher than normal. But that event that I live streamed over the weekend is something that I want to talk about because I think it really highlighted to me a real glaring issue in 11th edition Warhammer 40,000. For those who don't know, part of my content is traveling to events to live stream them, usually on the request of the event, and I'll go there, set up all these cameras and everything, and I'll typically live stream the top tables. And this past weekend, I live streamed the Summer Slaughter, which is an event by Wicked Dicey. The event went smoothly. There's no drama or anything like that, but I did have, I believe, over the 10 games that I ended up covering between my recorded table and my main table, 4 of those games that either ended early or had to be talked out from a relatively early battle round 3 or 4, before the end of the game. And that has some pretty serious effects on, obviously, the results of the game, but also the placement of the players. Now, obviously, talking out is a long and storied tradition in Warhammer 40,000. To explain kind of what it is, basically, when the results of a game is effectively determined, the players, instead of going through all of the minutia of running through every single game action to get to the final result, they'll just estimate the final scores. This is generally accepted by tournaments and by tournament packets. It saves time, it allows the players to decompress after the game, and it basically allows you to conserve a lot of energy that you would be going through, effectively doing blank action. The other thing that it can be used for is getting to the result of a game when the allotted time for a round has elapsed. Typically, games in Warhammer 40,000 will last 3 hours. They'll have a 3-hour round timer to complete the game. And at the end of that, typically there'll be an event rule that will adjudicate who wins if the game hasn't reached a natural conclusion. To prevent that adjudication from being necessary, oftentimes what will happen is that when players get near or hit the round timer, estimate themselves a score. Essentially, they'll say, hey, let's draw secondaries. We'll see what secondaries is reasonable for us to score, and we'll talk it out from there, right? I'll probably be getting these primary points. You'll probably be getting those primary points. The next turn, I'll probably be able to contest this, and then I'll score these secondaries, and you'll score those secondaries, and that's our final score. That's all well and good, except that the necessity of this practice has been greatly expanded by 11th edition for a bunch of different reasons. First of all, the setup phase of the game in 11th edition is dramatically more complex than it has been ever in the past. The players now have to go through and set up all of their terrain features. There's more terrain on the table than there has been in a really long time, just in terms of like the number of physical elements between the templates and the terrain pieces on top of the templates. It's a ton. In addition to that, armies are a little bit more complex, so players are taking a little bit more time to understand what their opponent's army does. There are occasionally some rules that come up, but the other thing is just that the actual gameplay is much longer and more complex than it was back in 10th edition, especially in early turns, because armies can be a little bit more aggressive in 11th edition than they could in previous editions. You oftentimes will see engagement on turn 1, whereas in 10th edition, turn 1 was very much jockeying. You almost had one round where players took very little attacks. It was mostly about positioning. It was mostly about maneuvering around the battlefield. And in 11th edition, oftentimes those armies are just immediately engaged. And so when you have these armies that are fighting immediately, the attack sequence in 40k takes a long time to resolve. 10th or 11th edition's done some great stuff in reducing the length of time it takes to do things like allocate wounds, but it hasn't solved the problem entirely. And especially when you have aggressive melee armies, the fight phase is not only the most time-consuming part of fighting in Warhammer 40k, but it's also made more so by 11th edition because combat movement is so much less prescriptive than it has been in 10th. So in 10th edition, in many cases, you would pick up your model and the rules would instruct you where it has to go, and if it can move into base contact with an enemy, it must do so. So most of the time, you pick up your model and go, I have to go to base contact with this guy, so the only place I'm allowed to go is here. And you would just move all your models, and that was it. In 11th edition, models are able to move more freely. They aren't required to move to base contact, which means they're able to maneuver around inside the combat. And because you now have to get everyone into 2-inch engagement range, it's more important that your positioning is correct in order to make sure you can maximize the number of models that you get within 2 inches of your opponent. And you also want to be able to maneuver to stop them from doing any weird combat shenanigans. So the fight phase is a lot more time consuming. There tends to be more attacks just in general that are resolved because you oftentimes are shooting or fighting in earlier in the game. And then the other thing is that a lot of missions require that you're able, in order for the mission to be balanced, that both players are able to get an equal number of rounds scoring, and that you're able to score in the final round of the game. So in a lot of cases, you'll see players who have a really depressed score, but they have a lot of secondaries in hand, or they have end of game scoring in their primary mission. And so it's really important for them to play all 5 rounds, because then they can play out all those secondaries and they can get their end of game scoring, and they can actually determine the exact final score. You have this compounding issue of longer setup time, more complex attacks, more attacks on average being resolved, and the requirement for the game to go the full time, which means it's really easy for games to go overtime. It would require some really fundamental changes in order for that not to be the case, but I do think it's something that's worth discussing, because at the event we had several games where the last 2 battle rounds were essentially talked out, and the results of the game, I think, swung a little bit based on those discussions. And obviously the players agreed on the final result. It's not like anyone was, felt shorted by this exchange, but it is anticlimactic to have a very close game that's decided by a talk out because you just ran out of time. And the proportion of games that are running out of time in 11th edition is wild. As I said, in the case of that one event, it was about 40% of games that did not have time to run to their natural conclusion. And obviously, from my perspective, there is a little bit of additional time pressure on the players. There is the live stream going on. I have to discuss how the live stream works. I have to run them through using the scoring software, and then they have to actually use the scoring software. But on the whole, that's probably not more than an added 10 or so minutes to the full time of the game. And I don't think that entirely accounts for players being basically missing out in some cases on 2 full battle rounds. I think that there has to be a bit of a push either to reduce the amount of time that setup takes, or to extend round timers for 40K events. I think so right now 3 hours is the natural. Sometimes events will give 15 to 20 minutes beforehand to set up and run through their armies, and that helps a little bit. But I think that 3 hours and 20 minutes or so is about the minimum for gameplay to naturally resolve. I don't think that you can really shrink beyond that. And then you have to add setup time on top of that. So I think we probably should be pushing to 3 hour 30 or 3 hour 45 minute rounds for competitive tournament games in order for those games to conclude. And obviously that puts a lot of pressure on tournament organizers. It extends the length of time the event lasts. It extends the amount of time they have to hold a venue for example. It restricts how much breakdown time they have if the event goes longer. So it's a big ask, but in my opinion, I think it's a transformation that the 40K community probably needs to consider making if they want their games to be concluded using the current rules. And there are some sort of institutional changes that could be made in the mechanical side of the game that could restrict this. The big one being that you could run with fixed layouts. The current mission structure is designed around modable layouts. Basically, they have a lot of layouts that have a certain position of objectives or placement of objectives or number of objectives in order to balance out the 2 primary missions against each other. So that's very difficult to do. It would require kind of some sort of redesign of the mission structure, but that could be a direction to go in. Otherwise, I think it would be essentially core rules changes that change the cadence of the game and push maybe more of the resolution of the game to the early game, or they push more of the aggression of the game to the later mid-game when you have less units that are ultimately engaged in melee. So it would take a lot to change, but I do think it is an issue that's worth talking about, because I do think it is something that, as the edition goes on and armies get more complex, is likely to be more and more relevant as we go. And that said, 11th edition is fucking awesome. It's the best Warhammer 40K has ever been. It's the most balanced. It's the most interesting. The games are the tightest and most exciting. In that same event, we did talk about how talkouts kind of made a lot of some of the final resolutions a little awkward, but it also had some of the tightest games that we've seen on stream. Things coming down to single attack activations to determine the outcome of the game. That's fucking sick. And we haven't really had that level of close, interesting gameplay in a competitive 40K to the same degree as we have in 11th edition. So I'm not going to say that 11th edition is bad. I'm not going to say that 11th edition is broken, but I am going to say that 11th edition does need a little bit of a resolution in terms of this timing thing. But otherwise, that's all I have to say for today. A little bit of a thought to get off my chest here. Thanks for watching. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.